Good morning. Today is April 6th, 2020. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Beth Gallick, Executive Director of the Bay Area Manufacturers Association, or BAMA. This webinar is made possible thanks to the Florida Makes Network. The mission of the Florida Makes Network is to improve the productivity and technological performance of Florida's manufacturing sector. The Florida Makes Network is an industry-led initiative operated by Florida's regional manufacturers associations in partnership with industry, research, educational, and economic development organizations, both public and private, at the state and national levels. The network provides services focused on three principal value streams: technology adoption, talent development, and business growth. BAMA, your host for today's webinar, is proud to be part of the Florida Makes Network. We support manufacturers and promote economic development in the Tampa Bay region. BAMA provides a forum to exchange ideas and share best practice information, network with colleagues, and learn about manufacturing-related topics through educational programs and tours. BAMA supports STEM programs and offers scholarships to students pursuing manufacturing and STEM education. If you'd like to know more about us, please check out our website, www.bama-fl.org. If you're an attendee from a county that BAMA does not service, please contact Florida Makes so they can connect you to your local regional manufacturers association. We're committed to bringing you the content you've requested during this time of crisis. Our next webinar is April 7th, Online Training, Strategies to Develop Employees During a Time of Uncertainty. And we are currently working on a manufacturers panel discussion. Due to the busyness of our manufacturers and the uncertainty of the climate currently, we did have to move that from this upcoming Wednesday, but we still are working on getting the manufacturers panel discussion organized. As a participant, your audio will be in listen-only mode using your phone or computer. There is an opportunity to ask your questions using the question window. Add your questions there, and we will address those as time allows at the end of each presentation. This is a live webinar event and will be recorded. A link to the recording will be provided to you within a few days. Today's presentation is titled COVID-19, Best Practices, Blockchain, Cybersecurity, and Managing Liquidity. We have three presentations today from experts in their field: Marie Morales of Clifton Larson Allen, Suzanne Chambers of Roebuck Technologies, and Rosa Shores and Chris Tyler of Block Spaces. Maria Morales is an audit principal in the Tampa office of Clifton Larson Allen. Maria has more than 22 years of accounting experience. She's responsible for performing and supervising audit, accounting, and consulting engagements. Maria leads the IFRS audit engagements for the firm nationally. Additionally, Maria leads the manufacturing and distribution audit practice and employee benefits plan practice for the Tampa Bay and Florida markets, respectively. Prior to her move, more than 18 years of work, she's worked 18 years in public accounting and in private accounting. She has served on various female initiative committees that focused on the advancement, retention, and empowerment of female professionals. Welcome, Maria.
Thank you, Beth. First of all, our priority is your health and the wellness of you and your families. And from all of us at the CLA family, we want you to know we're thinking of you. As Beth mentioned, I will be covering some basic reminders and key areas that you should be focused on to manage your business's liquidity during these uncertain times. These concepts will be a refresher for many of you, but ideally a mindful strategy to ease some anxiety and create a plan. As you can imagine, we've already had multiple discussions with many of our clients to answer their many questions surrounding managing their liquidity, emergency funding sources, changes in their operations and operational challenges, as well as, of course, the changing legislation. In the essence of time, I won't cover each slide in specific detail, but I wanted to include some content that you can reference to afterwards. Next slide, Beth. As stated, I will be covering 5 key areas to manage your liquidity, as summarized here. And with that, I'll start on the next slide with our first step. And so the first step in managing liquidity is really you need to understand your cash and working capital needs. And I will say this, don't be embarrassed today, and you won't be alone if you don't understand what your daily or monthly cash burn is. However, if you don't know today, after this presentation, that's the first thing you really need to look at. Next slide. So here are some basics around understanding your cash needs. As an auditor, many times we look at forecasting from a budget to actual perspective in our audits, as well as the upcoming year to understand what's going to happen next for your business. In these kind of times, these uncertain times of financial stress potentially, when you look at a lot of your budgets and forecasts, a lot of times you're somewhat aggressive at times and contain more of a stretch goal. When you're doing this for the process of understanding your liquidity in crises like this, you really want to start with a realistic model. And that model, you should apply a variety of different sensitivity analysis to that forecast and enable you to do that. So start with the proper baseline and then go from there. Part of that process is that you really need to understand your customer base and be in constant communication with them to understand how they're being impacted and how ideally that may impact you. That process really needs to understand from a forecasting perspective the interplay and the inner workings of your working capital, which is really driven a lot by your accounts receivable collections, your payables, and how far you can potentially stretch things. And then the interplay with that with your line of credit availability with the various scenarios that you run in your forecasting models. Next slide. For many of us, human capital is the most important resource. Evaluating that needs to be done to maintain that weak workforce is not only nerve-wracking, but very complicated, especially in times like this, because there is so much unknown and uncertain as it relates to this timeline, this unknown timeline. Part of the CARES Act and the Families First Act is really to provide options like the Paycheck Protection Program loan that'll help you, at least in the near term, maintain that workforce. And that may be a great option for you, not only because there are forgiveness options with that, which I'll later speak about, but it's really incentivized to have businesses maintain their workforce as much as possible. We've seen many companies already make difficult decisions to furlough their employees. Others have taken more of a family approach in that they've adjusted compensation across the board for all of their employees, and in certain respects, starting with their key officers. The key to managing, again, your working capital is really understanding and managing the payables, your receivables, and your inventories closely. One thing I'll point out is that concept that, cash is king and the value-added revenue idea and concept. And what I mean by that is, you really need to understand what your fixed costs are. Once you've covered that, any sales on top of that, any slim margins on top of that from a sales perspective drops right to your bottom line. So I will just say, don't focus too much on a margin project by project or purchase order by purchase order basis in times like this. Remember, cash is king. Next slide. Lastly, and it probably goes without saying, that you want to defer any non-essential costs. There will be natural savings, I hate to say, out of this because of the travel restrictions. A lot of trade shows have been canceled, marketing dollars. So there'll be some savings in there that you need to incorporate in your forecasting and understand basically what non-essential costs that you can live without, especially as it relates to capital and property-related needs. One last point I wanted to make on that is, there's always an owner behind the business, right? And a lot of time, many of you are business owners yourself on this webinar today. You have a lot of wealth tied up in your business, and you can't forget the holistic view of protecting not only the business, but equitably finding that balance between the business and business owner. Next slide. So we're going to dig a little bit further into your costs, and ideally understanding the costs that you can and the costs you cannot control. And we'll start with a little bit of a more challenging polling question. If you want to move to the next slide, and James can pull in the first polling question. Well, I was interested in knowing how many of you already made the difficult decision to lay off or furlough a portion of your workforce. I'll give that a quick second. And James, I don't know if you want to close the poll and see what the results are. So happy to report that most of you have not. With that, we'll go to the next screen. And that's good to know with a lot of the programs, loan programs that are available out there to help you maintain that. And for those of you who've already laid off, there's options to potentially bring back some of that workforce online related to those programs. There's a couple key points because we've already hit on some concepts around cost and those concepts. You know, one key reminder that I want to share with the group is really don't forget your mission and values as it relates to the organization during these difficult times and these difficult decisions, and make sure you remember what that long-term goal is for the organization. And the last big key point related to this slide that I really just want to capture is that monitoring aspect of things. Once you've come up with a plan for cost reductions, really make sure that you're monitoring and following through with it as you go through this process. Next slide, please. This slide nicely recaps a lot of the concepts that you already evaluate, and some of which we've already mentioned. Every great organization has a contingency plan, and not only do they have it, but they use it. They communicate it openly, effectively, and execute it timely. And the biggest thing there is they really monitor it. A lot of the concepts on this slide, I'll just hit on a couple of them that we haven't mentioned, that I know several organizations that are doing that have seasonal hirings within their business. Is hiring delays. That's another great way to save costs, especially if a lot of you are remote working or have a reduced workforce on staff or can have on staff, especially because it takes a lot of training on the upfront standpoint. Discretionary benefits, I think that goes probably without saying, but things like 401k and profit share and bonus structures of any discretionary nature, that's the first thing that you can cut back on from a spending perspective. Next slide. So what is some of our clients are doing? Next slide. At CLA, we have a financial forecasting model that many of our clients use. In fact, one of our biggest clients is actually us, our firm. Our firm uses this model. We have a tool known as CLA Intuition that we've actually retooled and labeled as the COVID-19 financial planning model. This picture captures that thought process behind the timeline of this crisis and the strategic planning and forecasting that needs to be done there. All of us are experiencing this dip. The biggest question is, how long are we going to experience this dip? When is it going to turn around? How long is it going to take me to recapture, that lost revenue, and when can I get back to normal? That's the big question. I wouldn't pay attention to the timeline at the bottom of this slide, but these are just multiple scenarios. Our tool can help you forecast and adjust and tweak and go through multiple scenarios. Next slide. The goal of this tool is really to develop that contingency plan, and it covers a lot of the concepts we've already discussed. What's nice about this tool, it helps you easily navigate and tweak and adjust multiple different scenarios and adjust that timeline for how much, when, and how long. Next slide. This is a screenshot of the tool. As you can see on the left, it takes a lot of those concepts like working capital changes, turning days, recovery days, revenue shortfalls, and it lets you apply multiple scenarios over a variety of different timelines. Next slide. The benefits are recapped on this slide, and I'll let you refer to that later. But if you were interested in understanding what are the key things in a model that you should be incorporating or looking at a demo of the CLA intuition model, I've included a link for you to refer to later. Next slide. So the next big step is really evaluating your customers and suppliers. Out of curiosity, I've included a polling question, really just hopefully understanding how quickly you can navigate and the diversification of your customer base. And we'll move to that next polling question, James. So have you shifted or are you shifting your product mix to essential goods like healthcare during these times? I'll give you guys a second. And we'll see how that looks so far, James. So about almost 50-50 split. It's good to see that there's some diversification in your customer base. We've seen several of our clients were already diversified in somewhat of a healthcare space and other essential goods and have been able to navigate that, some of which are surprisingly leveled off based upon the customers or end users that they serve. So that's interesting. Great. Next slide. One more slide, Beth. Perfect, we'll stay there. So as you can imagine, I won't go over all these key things. These are just key reminders, customers and supplier relationships that you need to evaluate. But I'll just say this, we're all in this together. Make sure you work together the best you can with your customers and vendors. The biggest thing here is don't take everything at face value, as you know, and don't assume that your customers and even your vendors in that case are financially healthy. Work together to negotiate the best and fairest terms possible. And always, I'll remind you again and again to monitor a plan that you put in place. Next slide. And we'll jump ahead one more slide, Beth. So communication is key, and I know many of you have definitely done this. But your stakeholders and your lenders and your banks, I know you've probably been on the phone with them at extensive, ad nauseum, I would probably say in the last week with all the changes that have come through. But if you haven't talked to them, I think it's critical to do that right now, to understand, because they're the ones that are going to help you through this process and evaluate and make key decisions into your strategic plan to get through this crisis. And use this opportunity to start negotiating now. We see many banks that are here to help, just like we're here to help our clients with covenant waivers, understanding and shifting around certain timelines. For example, your annual audit deadline, many of you have 4/30 deadlines. Banks are already in negotiations and giving month to 2 month that delays on that. And that's helpful from a cash flow perspective and obviously from a priority perspective, because you need to manage your business first and foremost through these times and work on things like the emergency funding sources that are now available. Next slide. And certainly not least, you'll need to identify those emergency funding sources that I'm fairly certain many of you have already started working through in that process. And with that, I'll ask my final polling question. James, if you want to pull it up. So how many of your organizations have began to apply for some form of emergency funding, resource, or loan. I'll give that a second. And James, if we've got most of the people answering, let's see what we come up with. So again, the majority of you, as I would expect it, have already started with those programs and started applying through those. Go to the next slide. So as many of you are aware and have already started applying for certain emergency fund resources, many of which are listed on this slide here, the CARES Act and the Families First Act was passed into law. And as you can see, there are a variety of different funding sources. There's a lot of information and there's a lot of confusion of what's what. And not only that, not listed here is there are certain specific loans directly with the state of Florida that are available through this crisis. There's a lot of content out there, and there's been separate webinars, as Beth mentioned, in the Bama/Florida Make series that have provided more in-depth guidance around the PPP, the EIDL, and the CARES Act specifically to help your businesses. So I would refer and defer to that content, but I would also like to share with you the content that CLA has been pushed out. Next slide. We've actually launched a COVID-19 resource center that contains detailed content, and it summarizes many of the legislation. In the middle of the screen here, you'll see that regulatory and tax updates. If you were to click on that on our webpage, it'll take you to a variety of different resources that really truly summarize each pieces of the key legislation that might interest you. In addition to that, as you can see on the next slide, we've actually created a CLA task force to take on this initiative to help our clients and other businesses to identify issues with the loan process. And we've actually have a team of consultants on staff that have entrenched themselves in this new legislation, and we have a bunch of consultants on staff that can help you through that loan process, as well as the CLA intuition model, the COVID edition that I shared with you. They can help with that. Next slide, Beth. Of course, if you have any questions specific to other ideas or concepts that I shared today, you can reach out to my email address on that, as well as that task force that I mentioned with CLA, known as the COVID funding at CLA Connect. And thank you again, and I'll turn it back to Beth if there's any questions and to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Maria. We appreciate that. We do have a few questions, and you may have answered this, but are there any other resources your clients are using to manage their cash flows?
Yes. So in addition to the CLA intuition model, we've gotten a lot of clients that like the COVID edition. They're definitely interested in it, but they've been using the task force as well as reaching out to their local bankers for ideas. Right now, those bankers are kind of a critical resource for immediate details, because a lot of the terms that you would think are in the legislation are really dictated by the banker. So I would say start with your bankers, look at the CLA web page and get some good ideas and knowledge bases of what you should be considering.
Great, thank you. And have your clients started to apply for emergency fund resource, and what types of information is being requested of them?
Yes, they actually have. So many of the things that are being requested, and it depends on obviously what type of loan you're applying for. If you are a part of the PPP program, a lot of that is payroll related information. They've been including support for as far as 941s that have been filed to support their calculations, and a lot of tax forms, prior audit reports, certain legal questions and legal specifications around affiliated companies. Those are the types of questions that I've been getting regularly.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Maria. We appreciate your time today. And if anyone has additional questions for Maria, please add those to the chat bar and we can email those to you after the webinar. I would like to take this opportunity to introduce our next presenter, Suzanne Chambers. She's an account manager with Roebuck Technologies. They're a managed IT and cybersecurity company. Managing a company's IT network is all about trust, and businesses depend on having consistent, reliable access to their data, financials, and client network. Suzanne, account manager of Roebuck Technologies, had been named the Greater Tampa Chamber of Commerce ambassador for the quarter, with more than 25 years in the IT services industry. Suzanne knows the importance of building a client relationship, being accessible, and providing solutions to customer issues. She takes great pride in having built a strong network of clients and vendors in the Tampa Bay area over the past 2 decades through her loyalty and dedication to excellence. Suzanne has been a vital member of the Roebuck Technologies team for nearly 2 years, helping businesses throughout the greater Tampa Bay area with proactive IT support. She has also been an integral part in the planning of many of the events at the Bay Area Manufacturers Association as part of many of the committees for BAMA. So we do thank Suzanne for that. And at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Suzanne. Thank you.
Thanks, and hi, everybody. Can you guys hear me okay? Hopefully. Yes. Good. Technology is always out there to get you, so I want to make sure I'm able to be heard. As you mentioned, I've worked for Roebuck Technologies now for about 2 years. I've been in the business for about 30. And we're an IT consulting and managed services company located here in Tampa, and we help make sense of IT for many businesses. You know, this past month here has been an absolute crazy mad rush to get our clients up and running in the new work from home model. And I'm sure you've all been scrambling to get yourself set up the same way. And while we're all working to get the kinks out of the new way of doing things, we can't forget the importance of staying secure. It's a huge topic, and the last thing that any company needs right now is a data breach. Beth, the next slide. It seems like yesterday we were all collaborating at the office. For the most part, we took for granted the amount of communication that actually took place there, the face-to-face, and being inside our secure offices. Random people were not waltzing into our meetings, as has been happening to some of the virtual meetings out there. I don't know if you've heard about it, but my sister-in-law was on a meeting the other day with her church, and all of a sudden, a bunch of adult content came flying over the screen. It was absolutely horrifying, but it was because the meeting was not secure. It was plastered out there on social media, and with no passwords or any kind of protection, it invited anyone into that meeting. So we miss those walls. We miss being able to be in a secure meeting. Today's, I'm sorry, next slide, Beth. You know, today's new normal has us sharing our office with our four-legged assistants, and that can be great, but we are alone, and we're more apt to not ask questions. And we need to lock our doors, but we also need to lock our network. Next slide. As business owner or manager, how secure are the home offices of your employees, and how secure are the connections to the company data? While many companies have put together a business continuity plan for hurricanes and weather-related disruptions, not many have planned for this. This is 30 days plus of some companies having to be working this remote model. Unfortunately, the bad guys have been waiting and are ready to exploit as many companies as possible. And there are 3 areas that I wanted to talk about. 3 of the security areas that you can get a jump on and secure without too much input from your IT team. And remember that security is all about the layers of protection. And we can go to the next slide, Beth. I'm going to talk about social engineering, device and application security, and securing your Wi-Fi connection. And again, it's at a high level because there's so much into it, but these are things that I think you can get a start on right away. And we can start with social engineering. Social engineering can be defined as the use of deception to manipulate individuals into divulging confidential or personal information that may be used for fraudulent purposes. This is happening at an increased level through emails today. You may have noticed that your emails have increased. The criminals know you're overwhelmed and hope you do not take the time to inspect your emails. You have to take a deep breath. Make sure those emails you are responding to are from the person you think it is from. We're relying on our personal devices to conduct some, if not all, of our business. And through these devices, they're not secure like they are when you are at work. Our personal devices, and I'll get into it a little bit later, are not set up the way our business devices are. We don't have that security. Make sure that the email addresses match completely. If you see that it's coming from Joe Smith, make sure the email is from Joe Smith. You can hover over the email address and make sure that it is legit. If you even have a hint that something's off, call the person that is supposedly sending the email. It's much better to take that extra few minutes than to open up your company to data breaches. If you don't recognize a company that's asking you to go to a link for any reason, stop. Call the company. These criminals will tell you your account is past due and to open up the invoice. They will tell you the package is on the way and to please click here for your proof of delivery. These attachments and links will open your computer to the criminal so they can use you as a springboard to your company. This is much like how criminals have in the past used small businesses to springboard to larger corporations. And the same goes for phone calls. Another social engineering tactic that many of us, don't even think about. Don't give out information on the phone either. Politely ask for the company's name, the caller's name, and after checking out the company, then you can call them back. Next slide. Device and application security. If you're not using your company-issued laptop, is your laptop using the up-to-date operating system? You should be using Windows 8 or better at this time. Windows 7 and below are no longer supported by Microsoft. This opens you up to breaches. They're no longer giving security patches and updates. Make sure that you're using commercial-grade antivirus. And make sure that you're doing the updates that pop up. This is very important because these patch fix security bugs. These are patches and they fix the security bugs, and without them, it opens up your device. The updates are there for a reason. Yes, they can be a pain in the neck. Yes, it might take a few minutes for the updates to be done. And make sure you're not using free antivirus. It's not acceptable for business. Free is never free. It is filled with adware, spyware, and it's very inexpensive to get the business antivirus, and it's absolutely essential. If you need any help in that in any way, please reach out and I can point you in the right direction. Another thing that you might look at is two-factor authentication. If you're unfamiliar with this, many banks use it, and many business applications are demanding it. There are many to choose from. Some will send your phone a code that you'll enter onto a website. Some will give you security questions, and some will actually do facial or biometric authentication. And yes, it is one more step, but it's absolutely worth it. Beth, next slide. Whoops, I guess I should have done 3 in a row here. Go ahead and next. And next. There you go. Secure the Wi-Fi connection. Now, we all have our home internet, and Spectrum or Frontier brought out their router, and you probably have the password somewhere on the refrigerator or next to your desk so that your family and friends can connect. This is not the time to have your friends and all your family on your internet. So change the password now. Many times this password is a factory default, and the hackers and criminals know how to crack these. You'll also want to make sure that you have your setting at the WPA2 encryption. Simple to use. If you go to the manufacturer's website of your device, it will have information there. We also can change the name on the device. The name choice doesn't necessarily protect by itself, but when you have the bad guys out there and the network attackers looking for a good device to crack, they're going to be looking for ones that have the factory defined name on it. Many will have, for Bright House Networks will have BHN and then a long number, or Spectrum, it'll say My Spectrum and the number. Change that, because it's in a typical residential neighborhood with a lot of home networks, they're going to target the one that looks like it's the weakest. And the other thing to think about, and we really don't have to think about it today, is using Wi-Fi that is public. We're not really sitting at Starbucks anymore, but we need to make sure that if you are on a public Wi-Fi, you're not accessing any personal data, company data, or bank accounts. Shopping online is also frowned on because, again, it's not encrypted and anyone can spy on what you're doing. Next slide. There are other things to think about when you're trying to do your work from home. And security should always be in the forefront. But you might, with this time, start thinking about the different things that are out there for communications, for project management, for VoIP, if you're using your phone system to be able to work from anywhere, and group discussion software such as Zoom, how to use it and how to do it securely. Stay away from the free tools. Again, I can't emphasize this hard enough. It's very important to make sure whatever communication tools you're using or productivity tools, that they are secure. Talk to someone in your IT department or your trusted IT partner before downloading any of these tools. Make sure it's a tool that will complement your business and your current infrastructure, and that it can be used moving forward. There are many companies out there right now promoting different software packages that are trying to take advantage of you at this time. Make sure it's something that will fit your business. And next slide. Something to consider strongly is cybersecurity training. There are quite a few different ways to do this. Many fit your budget. It's not a terribly expensive thing to do. You can take it on yourself. I'd be happy to speak with you at another time about this, but no matter how secure you think your network is, according to a 2017 Verizon breach report, 90% of successful network breaches were caused by user error. This does not mean malicious. People don't do this just trying to, do terrible things to your company. It's lack of knowledge. And next slide. So welcome to the future, right? If you have any questions at all, I'd be glad to hop on a call and get you in the right direction. We're here to support you. We want to help the community in this time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suzanne. We appreciate that. We do have a question for you. Is work from home security to do it right for work, school, and other security cost allowable or cost prohibitive to do right?
Is it, I'm a little confused on the question. Is it cost prohibited to do it right?
Correct. So they want to know, you know, is the cost prohibitive to do it, or is it, you know, something that would be manageable, the cost?
It's very manageable. You know, if you're in the office, you probably have servers upon servers, or you're in the cloud. But to do it from home, those three things that I talked about are so key. Make sure that your Wi-Fi is secure. Make sure that you're watching what you're doing 10 times harder than you do when you're in the office. You probably don't have the spam filters and the security on your laptop at home. Just pay attention and make sure that you're doing the right thing. Antivirus is not an expensive thing to put on your computer. It's extremely expensive if you try to use something free and then open up your company information out there on the web. I don't know really if there's other things you're thinking about at this time from that question, but you know, feel free to reach out and I can kind of work through it with you.
Okay, thank you, Suzanne. And another thing we would recommend is we are providing this webinar and the slides, so that would be something to share with your workforce to make sure that they're familiar with what's out there and what they can do individually. But thank you very much, Suzanne. We appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Next, I would like to introduce our next presenters. They are from BlockSpaces. We have Rosa Shores. She's the co-founder and CEO of BlockSpaces, a blockchain-focused product development company headquartered here in Tampa, Florida. As a 7-year veteran of the blockchain industry, she's well-rounded, recognized and well-rounded in the community as a passionate speaker and advocate for blockchain technology, and is the co-organizer of several of the largest and longest running blockchain groups within the Tampa Bay region since 2014. Also, Chris Tyler, he's an experienced IT professional with over 25 years of experience in the software industry. Over the past 15 years with IBM, he's been a trusted advisor to many software companies on the monetization of data through the use of analytics, data science, LOT, and blockchain. Recently, Chris has taken on the role of Chief Technology Officer for BlockSpaces, a thought leader in blockchain technology. So we're very thrilled to have them both here on the presentation with us today. And I'll turn this over to Rosa and Chris.
Thank you so much, Beth. And we want to first off echo the sentiments of the other presenters in hoping that all of our listeners today are staying safe and healthy. As small business owners ourselves, we are right on the ground floor with you. And although we all want to get back to business and need to get back to business, we do put family first and recognize that you all are likely doing the same. So we really appreciate your time this morning in coming to learn some new innovation in some ways that we can all kind of work together to get through this moment in time, these unprecedented times. And they really are unprecedented times. As Beth mentioned, I'm an early adopter in this space. And so we've seen a lot of changes in this space since 2013, 2014, and ridden some hype cycles up and down and some incoming buzzwords. And it's always been a challenge with us to help give real world use cases for blockchain in a way that can give people very tangible things to hold on to and think about. As we are seeing blockchain now rise up to be positioned as a best practice rather than a buzzword, that is a shift in mindset. And we want to take this opportunity to really help you all understand in the context of COVID-19 how blockchain can be positioned for best practices. Next slide, Beth. Maybe one back. Just wanted to quickly mention and put our emails up here if you don't have time at the end of the question and answers, that in the interest of time, we only have a few minutes, and so in the interest of time, we're not going to delve too much into the very low-level technical aspects of blockchain. Although if you have questions in that regard or want to talk to us, please just shoot us an email. So just wanted to make sure everyone had our email there. Chris will touch on that a little bit later on in the presentation, but we certainly don't have enough time to go into it in any kind of great detail. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you would like to speak with us further. Next slide. And we are here because of COVID-19. So it is one of the interesting things that we've seen evolve here as we've watched sort of what has happened with supply chains in this particular environment. And as I mentioned before, we are seeing supply chain weaknesses that we recognized existed, but were difficult to explain sometimes in the concept of blockchain. In the past, even maybe a handful of months ago, when you're talking to a corporation or a business about how blockchain can be, inherently resilient to failure, inherently resilient to weaknesses, whereas if one node goes down, the rest of the network doesn't go down. That's one thing to explain that to a business, and it's quite another to actually experience it. And of course, what we're seeing now, as this slide mentions in the first survey focused on COVID-19, the Institute of Supply Management did find that nearly 75% of companies are already reporting supply chain disruptions, mainly due to that one node going down, being Asian suppliers. And so this puts this concept of a distributed system, a distributed supply chain, being more resistant to failure in a whole new context. And so we now all have a very personal experience with that one node going down. That is the biggest promise of blockchain for the supply chain industry. And of course, as mentioned here also, Dun & Bradstreet is now showing that 938 of Fortune 1000 companies have a tier 1 or tier 2 supplier that has been affected by the virus. Again, with China being the most dominant as the world's factory, any disruption in that part of the supply chain puts the whole entire thing at risk. And that is really what we're focusing on today for the purposes of this discussion. I think we may have a poll question here. So we're curious to know what the level of negative impact COVID-19 has had on your current supply chain model. Be very. Okay, interesting. So next slide here. So some of you definitely have had some high impact there, which is very interesting to me. And one of the things from, as I mentioned, sort of from the outside looking in, the things that we're seeing from a blockchain perspective in this world where supply chains are somewhat fragile. Some of these points are points that traditional supply chains sort of have considered best practices in the past. Just-in-time manufacturing has been considered sort of a standard, but what we're seeing is those sorts of protocols leave supply chains less resilient to sudden shocks and supply shortages. Again, we can just turn to the news to kind of see this play out. Rigid supply chains leave businesses unable to quickly identify and connect with alternative suppliers. Again, with the concept of a distributed network of suppliers, if one node goes down, it's easy to identify and connect with an alternative node. These are concepts that we've talked about for years around blockchain. But when you have a real life use case that you can actually visualize now and see and feel, it becomes much more meaningful. Manual supply chain management, in addition to the lengthy and complex process of actual manual supply chain management, and we've talked to some very, very large corporations that are still utilizing manual supply chain. In addition to the length and complex process of a manual supply chain, there is now this concept of safety, pure physical safety, with passing paper manifests, with holding clipboards, with writing pencils. These are things that even a few months ago were unimaginable that now is top of mind for people. So these are things that support a more digitized supply chain management tools. Lack of transparency, being unaware of what's happening beyond the first tier of your supply chain. Again, when we speak of supply chain transparency within the concept of blockchain and trying to help a business understand how that transparency of what is happening at all levels of your supply chain, so you can easily identify threats to your production capacity at the moment they are conceived or the moment that they exist. These are things that perhaps just a handful of months ago did not have the meaning and relevancy that they do today. And then, of course, that final point goes back to what I spoke of in the first slide. These consolidated centralized centers of production, this reliance on a very centralized point, a very centralized node that is completely reliant of that node operating in order for the supply chain to be resilient. These are things that we are seeing the opportunity to rebuild these systems, these fragile systems, to be more anti-fragile. And do we have a poll question here, perhaps? In light of COVID-19, what would you consider the most important feature of your supply chain model to ensure business continuity? Ability to move away from just-in-time manufacturing, ability to connect to alternative suppliers, ability to move away from manual supply chain management, transparency to quickly assess threats, your production capacity, and ability to move away from centralized centers of production. Okay. Yeah, all of these, of course, are very important, but the ability to connect with alternative suppliers is a very important piece of blockchain systems. Okay, next slide, and I'm just going to touch on this briefly, because if we need to look no further than Jabil, just as again a few months ago, unprecedented to think that something like this would happen. But now, as we see, even local companies losing upwards to $55 million in 1 month because of a node going one supplier or one group of suppliers going offline. We need to look no further than very local use cases here. I don't want to spend too much time on this slide. I know Chris has some things he wants to go over with you all. So I don't know if we have a poll question after this, but I don't want to take up too much more of Chris's time.
Yeah, I think we had a poll question there, James. But,
okay.
If we want to just go on, we can do that. Yep, there you go.
Outside of supply chain, has the pandemic caused your change to normal business processes of your company? So anything outside of supply chain, are you seeing disruption within just your normal business processes? Difficult to imagine we wouldn't all have felt that in some way or another, but I'm trying to get a sense of, is the majority of the issues with your personally, with your supply chain or some of your normal business processes?
As we would expect. All right. Well, thank you, Rosa. And so I'm going to get into some of the little more details around blockchain. So what is blockchain? Blockchain is an append-only electronic ledger of transactions, and those verified transactions are recorded and linked together to, with digital fingerprints. And they're held by all of the participants on the network, right? So all the participants in the supply chain, using a blockchain would have visibility. You may not be able to see all the details, but they would have visibility to all those transactions. So James, I think one last poll question, and then we'll get into the specifics. So we're wanting to know, what would be the biggest obstacle for your business to consider a blockchain solution? We understand the uniquities of the time we live in today, right, with COVID-19, but is it budget, time and effort, choosing a vendor, lack of in-house expertise or knowledge? All right, James. Okay, so yeah, with what we find is right in line with a lot of this, right? There's just not a lot of knowledge of how blockchain can have a positive impact on supply chain. So let's get into that real quick. So with blockchain, next slide. With blockchain, we found that there are some best practices that you want to implement with blockchain development and implementation. First and foremost, right, privacy. Blockchain is really designed to provide transparency to things, but you also need to think about privacy, especially in healthcare. We have things like HIPAA, with just general consumer data, right? You have the GDPR in Europe. You have the California Consumer Protection Act, and it's going to get more pervasive, right? Being able to protect individual data. Next is with regards to enterprise blockchain, right? Separate from things like cryptocurrency, but enterprise blockchain, which supply chain would typically be in. You want to make sure that only those people that you trust, those organizations that you trust, are permissioned into the supply chain network, right? This transparency is open by nature, right? So a lot of this technology is open source, but and also with blockchain, you have the ability to share all the information, right? And so it's open by nature, but you want to make sure that you have, look over to the right, the governance capabilities, right? Governing when changes come in, how they're applied to the blockchain network, and so forth. So who's going to be responsible for managing the network? So you want to have those governance principles as well. You want to look to standards, right? We look in things like food safety or food supply chain and pharmaceutical supply chain, and they're leveraging a GS1 standard, right? And it just improves the collaboration between organizations because they're all using a set of standards, but also with back office systems and various different applications within the supply chain. Just makes that ease of transition and the ease of integration. And finally, security. We talked about cybersecurity earlier, but security is very important to setting up a blockchain, right? And there are security features within these blockchain technologies and these blockchain platforms that ensure that while everybody has visibility to the transactions that they are occurring, they may not be able to see the details unless they are privy or they are part of that transaction. So, and you want to plan all of that ahead of time. All right, so next slide. So let's talk a little bit about blockchain in supply chain. And what we find is, blockchain, because it's this sort of shared network, this place that we can put all of the information that's needed for the supply chain to operate a little more effective, more efficient. Right? What we've found is those that have implemented blockchain successfully into their supply chain processes, right, find that they are 13% or so more efficient. This is due to automation in decision making as things flow through the supply chain, right? Automation of contractual terms and conditions, right? And then you add in things like Internet of Things, IoT, right? And we find that those same blockchain networks start to become much more efficient because you know where things are in the supply chain. You know who's handling the goods. You know who has been a part of this. You know that the goods have been handled appropriately and so forth. And so now we find, or the surveys find, that these companies that are participating with blockchain and IoT as part of their supply chain become about 24% more efficient. Okay, so where we see this is, say, in typical manufacturing and logistics type supply chains, using things like GPS location, using things like smart sensors around the goods being transported. In food supply chain, using things like temperature sensors, using things like visual recognition and artificial intelligence, machine learning, to determine that the goods and services being transferred through the supply chain are what they say they are, and they're in proper condition. Right. Next slide. So we'll talk a little. We briefly touched on a few of these, right? So with regards to food safety and pharmaceutical provenance, right? This is one of the first use cases that we found with blockchain in supply chain, and Walmart has used blockchain in multiple different parts of their food supply chain. First, things like fresh shrimp and so forth. The biggest use, or the most prominent use case that we found, is the head of food safety at Walmart, gentleman named Frankie Innes at the time, went to his team and said, "Hey, I have this box of mangoes. Tell me where this came from." His team took it upon themselves to go and figure that out. It took them about 7 days, and that was primarily because of all of the different silos of information, all the different back office systems that they had to go to research where that box of mangoes came from. And when you talk about things like disruptions in a supply chain, such as what you see with romaine lettuce scare, you see it with the spinach scare back in the day, eggs, various different aspects of food supply chain where they've had this sort of tainting of the goods, and they need to impart some sort of recall on that information, or recall on those goods. Right? That takes time to go and find where it is, so they end up pulling everything off the shelf, and it actually starts to kill those businesses within the supply chain. Now, with blockchain implemented, Walmart can, that same set of mangoes, that same box of mangoes, they can find where it came from in 2.2 seconds. So instead of having to go and pull everything off the shelf, they can be much more targeted with their recalls. Right? And starting in November of 2019, the U.S. pharmaceutical industry is bound by a new set of regulations called the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. And one important aspect of this is that, medicine returned to the distributors they have to be able to, they have a unique product identifier that has to be part of that, those goods and service, or those goods being distributed and being resold. And this project called MetaLedger is a blockchain for the pharmaceutical industry, very similar to the food supply chain. The pharmaceutical supply chain is needing to do this so that they can track and trace things as drugs are being returned and resold. And both of these use cases, we talked about standards earlier, they're both implementing on this GS1 standard. So, all right, next slide. So also in supply chain, we have a use case around an organization called TradeLens that was born out of a joint venture between IBM and Maersk, and it's all around global trade and global supply chain, primarily in the transoceanic shipping. Containers are being tracked from when they're loaded onto a ship to when they're brought into port, and all of the things within those containers. And what they're finding is that there's somewhere around 10% more efficient through this process, mostly because of the digitization of the documentation, the timeliness that things can occur. We also talked earlier, I think Rosa mentioned, right, the visibility into the supply chain that lowers people's risks. So that's, in addition to being more efficient, right, they're also able to reduce some of the risk because they know at any given point where their goods are within the supply chain. Okay, so next slide. So we'll also talk about some steps to succeeding in blockchain. Some of these are more difficult, some of them are a little easier, right? But first and foremost, you got to identify an impactful use case, something that's going to have some sort of positive impact on not only your business but all the participants in the blockchain, in the supply chain network, right? In order to start to build this, right, you have to sort of start small, right, and identify some minimal viable ecosystem, or what some people call a minimal viable network. What is that minimum number of participants and participant types in this supply chain that could be part of this to prove out that this does help us be more efficient, provide valuable insights that we didn't have before. Outline that governance framework that I talked about. Who's going to own the changes? Who's going to own this network? Is it going to be run by a market maker like a Walmart, or is it going to be run by an industry like in the music industry, or is it going to be regulatory led like we find in say the cannabis network or the cannabis industry? The next thing is to choose a proper blockchain platform, and we won't go into grave detail, but there are blockchain networks that are really good with tokenization of assets and cryptocurrencies, and there are blockchains that are really good at just managing assets and participants and transactions that go around them, not really tied to any specific type of cryptocurrency or tokenization, just how do we manage all that? So, this is where Blockspaces over the last 7 years has been really good at educating people on what is the proper blockchain network to use for your supply chain or for your business process. Build that framework and infrastructure. Do I do this on my own? Do I install it on my own servers, or do I use something like a blockchain as a service? Most of the cloud providers are now providing blockchain as a service, and there's even some very blockchain specific providers that have their own blockchain as a service. Optimize security and scalability, right? You got to make sure that the data is secure, but also giving the transparency to the process. So making sure that you get that fine line drawn. And then finally, how do I incentivize people to participate? Because we are all sharing information. How do I make sure that everybody has some incentive to play? All right, next slide. All right, so finally, right, I think we were kind of transitioned earlier to welcome to the future. Well, blockchain is now part of that future, right? And it's becoming not so much pie in the sky sort of stuff. It's moving from that buzzword, right, to now we are starting to see best practices. We're starting to see networks built and become successful and start to showcase returns on those investments, right? And it's difficult to keep up with some of this change that's happening. And Blockspaces has been there since 2012 and has been educating people and teaching them how to understand this great technology and how it can apply. And so we're here to help, right? We're here to educate you. We're here to help you understand how your business can be transformed with this great technology. And at that, I'm going to finish up and see if there's any questions.
Thank you, Chris. I do not have any questions for you, but if anyone does have questions, please add those in or email those to us and we can get the answers out to you. Again, thank you, Chris, and I'd like to thank all of our presenters today. If you'd like any more information about any of these topics, please contact either myself or any of our presenters. As noted earlier, the recording of this webinar will be provided to you within a few days. I thank you all for attending today, and as you exit the webinar, we ask that you please complete the survey. We're seeking your feedback about how to improve these webinars and better meet your needs with topics of value to you. Thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar on April 7th.